what goes into making a good decision anyway? I woke up this morning, got dressed, made myself a cup of coffee, and absolutely nobody gave me grief about that. However, if I woke up this morning and decided to make my 2-year-old niece a cup of coffee, well, everybody and their grandmother would be judging me for it.
What's that?
Coffee.
Oh, okay.
It's easy to look at other people and see what they're doing and immediately lay condemnation on them. There is no group perhaps more vulnerable to this kind of scrutiny than parents. There's a lot of pressure on couples once they become mothers and fathers. Who knows what's best for the children? Is it mom and dad, or is it big brother? Well, this is precisely the question being asked in the Canadian Supreme Court case B versus Children's Aid Society of Metropolitan Toronto. Let's begin with the facts of the case. The appellants are Richard B. and Bina B., the parents, versus the respondents, Children's Aid Society of Metropolitan Toronto, the official guardian for Sheena B., an infant, and the Attorney General for Ontario. In summary, the infant Sheena was born prematurely and had serious medical issues. Her parents consented to all medical treatments except a blood transfusion, for it violated their religious conscience as Jehovah's Witnesses. However, Sheena became a ward of the Children's Aid Society of Metropolitan Toronto temporarily when her hemoglobin levels dropped to a rate where doctors said she required the transfusion. Also, she would later have to undergo a surgery that would also require another one. The appellants argue that under the Child Welfare Act, Section 19, subsection 1B9, the respondent's decision was not warranted on the grounds of loose wording. In the District Court of Ontario, it was ruled that the Section 2A charter right was not violated, as the Wheatley District Court judge determined that the act, which originated from a statute first adopted in 1927, was not aimed at the Jehovah's Witnesses, since they have only refused blood transfusions on the grounds of religious purposes since 1945. Additionally, it was argued by the respondents that the Charter Right, Section 7, Principles of Fundamental Justice, could not be invoked to deny a child a chance to live. The parents had brought forth evidence that there were inherent risks in a blood transfusion for non-surgical treatments, and that alternatives could have been employed. However, the judge ruled against this evidence and maintained that the use of the transfusion was in fact necessary. As this case progressed, there were further developments in the reasoning as to why the judges decided the way they did. For instance, the Section 7 Charter right regarding the principles of fundamental justice was more deeply elaborated on based on a precedent of the case R.V. Jones. In this case, Judge Wilson expressed her belief that the parent had the right to raise their child according to their conscience under Section 7. However, she acknowledged that there could be limits placed on liberty that does not imply the right to raise one's child or educate one's child as the parent sees fit. In this part of the case, the establishment of the definition of the Charter's meaning of liberty was taking place. Ultimately, this case ended with the Chief Justice ruling that parental autonomy is outside of the concept of liberty, and 4 other justices determined that the state has the right to interfere when the parents risk the child's health and autonomy. Common realization in cases surrounding family law that our definitions of certain parts of the family institution are not so obvious. The case Nova Scotia versus Walsh, well, what defines a spouse? The case of Stone 1924, what defines the family? The law and society are caught in a limbo of not knowing whether or not family should be the authority in our personal lives or the government. So what goes into making a good decision anyway? If the state is going to act paternalistically, assuming the role of caregiver, then what is the role of parents in our society? It is even being suggested that children do not need parents to make medical decisions, including assistance in dying. Carter versus Canada was a breakthrough Supreme Court case in achieving legislation for assistance in dying. The case was emotional, and the pain the Carters went through made Canadians sympathetic. Naysayers, however, always point to the slippery slope. One minute, it's older citizens with life-ending ailments. The next, it's people with mental illness and mature minors. Dying with Dignity Canada is a charity that lobbies the Canadian government to help everyone choose their good death. As you can see on screen, this even includes the push for accessibility to children as young as 12 years old. What Canadians thought would be an easing of pain has become a torture. What happened to a state having a right to interfere when the child's health is on the line? More and more parents are starting to speak up about these issues where the state is raising the kids how they see fit. The Million March was an example of parents feeling pushed aside by the system.
People here voicing their opinions all around. We spoke to some parents who say they want more parental rights in the education system. They say they want Ontario to follow the example of Saskatchewan and New Brunswick. Those provinces have recently introduced policies that require schools to inform parents if a child decides to use a different name or pronoun. Now, some here saying Ontario should have similar policies. Take a listen.
At the end of the day, we want to have a discussion. We want to establish a dialogue and say, listen, whatever is being taught to our kids, parents should have a right to know about that.
Aristotle said in his famed work Politics that the family is the association established by nature for the supply of men's everyday wants. End quote. What the state cannot provide for a child or anyone is love. When the parents of Sheena wanted other options besides a blood transfusion, was that evidence that they did not love their daughter? Maybe it does not make sense to our secular sensibilities, but maybe their love for Sheena and their religious worldview meant not violating their conscience. At the end of the day, the government does not know you or I and has on a number of occasions been anything but a loving parent. A cold institution which solves a drug epidemic with easier access to assisted suicide has to make us question if the government is capable of making decisions for our children. When it is true that a newborn baby will die if not held enough, not experiencing that expression of love, then what makes us think that the parents who held all of us wouldn't have done anything to preserve us? Perhaps the institution that raised us with the ability to care ought to be the authority instead of the institution that pretends to care.
I fall into the sea like a empire built on the sand. I've been thinking about the days when we had no money. The photograph of you, well, it still